So hello and welcome to Family Portraits, How Families Are Transformed by Grief, part of the Good Grief Festival. I'm Liesl Dawson, Associate Professor at the University of Bristol, and I'm really pleased to be facilitating this panel. All three speakers today have experienced the death of a sibling, and they have all written memoirs about how this experience impacted and shaped their identity, family, and memories in profound and complicated ways. Arifa Akbar is Chief Theatre Critic for The Guardian and author of Consumed, A Sister's Story. Gavanndra Hodge is a journalist who writes regularly for The Times and the author of The Consequences of Love. And Cathy Rentzenbrink is an acclaimed writer and speaker whose books include the memoir, The Last Act of Love, the novel, Everyone is Still Alive, and most recently, Write It All Down, How to Put Your Life on a Page. So it's lovely to have you all here. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I thought maybe we could just start a little bit with hearing from each speaker about themselves and their sibling who died, and a little bit about what drew them to write their memoirs. Arifa, could we start with you?
Yes, sure. My book, Consumed, is about my late sister. She was 2 years older than me. Her death was shocking and abrupt and shook me to the core, as every death does. But in this case, we're very close as children. We grew up to be very different. And then in 2016, she started having unaccountable chest pains, and she went to a really good hospital numerous times in North London, who couldn't find what was wrong with her. And then she had they gave her steroids. She went off and came back iller than ever, and she had a brain hemorrhage. Only after that she was diagnosed, shockingly, with tuberculosis, an ancient infectious disease that we have a cure for with antibiotics. So there were so many questions left unanswered because that hemorrhage was fatal. And to get a diagnosis after essentially a fatal hemorrhage was just bewildering and overwhelming for the family. And she had been somebody who'd suffered with teenage depression that had led to a lifetime's depression, an eating disorder that had taken hold throughout her life, and in a way, stopped her from what she wanted to do in her passions, and her biggest passion was art. So when she died in 2016, I had two big things remaining of her: this puzzling, shocking medical diagnosis, and medical notes that I'd ordered, that were very big and thick, huge questions about how the doctors could have had such a missed opportunity in diagnosing such an ancient illness. But also the other thing was her big portfolio of a lifetime of art, which included a lot of embroidery. So my investigations into our relationship with sisters, her death, my grief, came through those big piles of documents in a way. With her art, which said so much about her, about her view of the world through art, and also about us as sisters. I found myself in there. I found things about her that I didn't know, and exactly the same with the medical notes.
Thanks so much. I think we'll come back to you and her art, and also your family in the book. Gavanndra, could you tell us a little bit about your sister and what drew you to write your book?
Sure. So my sister Candy died when she was 9 and I was 14, and we were on holiday in Tunisia, and we had no idea that she was ill at all. She went to bed, she danced with my father for the first time. And also when you're on holiday, it's such a sort of time out of life and you're just having, a wonderful time. And then she went to sleep, woke up in the middle of the night, coughing, and died that night in my father's arms whilst I was standing in the room watching, and my mum had rushed down the corridor to find help. And it was such a shocking, unexpected, overwhelming thing to witness. that it affected me in multiple ways and the family. But most notably, I think, was my parents' very different responses to grief and how I intersected with them. So my father had been a drug addict while I was growing up and had been clean for 4 years approximately. And then subsequent to my sister's death, the following morning, drank a whole bottle of whiskey and passed out. My mum had also, she'd been an alcoholic, but she, rather than trying to numb her grief, sort of fully experienced it and sat in it. But I found her response as a 14-year-old really impossible to kind of live with. So I ended up, and my father having that drink the day after Candy died, then returned to taking drugs and this very kind of sybaritic, decadent life. And I decided that was also for me a good response to grief, because forgetting felt much, much easier than grieving. And furthermore, the kind of the culture of the time, so we're talking Candy died in the early 90s. When I went back to school, so I was told to stay off school for 1 day so they could explain that my sister had died, and, you know, everyone had to be super nice to me. And I went back to school the following day, really not knowing what to say, what to think, how people wanted me to be. And the really surprising thing is no one mentioned it to me. Like, not a single person said, oh, I'm sorry, or anything. So what I took away from that is that people were so horrified by what had happened, they wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. So I then thought, okay, you know, I'm a 14-year-old girl. I want people to want to hang out with me. I'm going to pretend that my sister hasn't died. And therefore, I will have to pretend that she didn't live. And the outcome of that is that by the time I got to about 40 and had 2 children, 2 girls who oddly were the same difference in age as my sister and I had been, I looked at them and I realized, and I looked at their sort of sibling interaction, and I realized I had absolutely no memory of my sister at all. She died, someone's just saying, wow, the same thing happened to me. She died when I was 14 and she was 9. We'd shared a bedroom. You know, we had been siblings. We'd grown up together. I could remember nothing about her. I couldn't remember the sound of her voice. I couldn't remember how it felt for her to hug me. And then I felt so sad that I had lost her twice. And it felt like the second time I'd lost her, it was my own fault. It's something I'd done. And I felt sort of guilty because, you know, you're told that as the survivor, it's your job to kind of maintain the memory of the person who's gone, and that's how we keep them alive. That's how we breathe life into their death. And I felt like I'd failed at that terribly. So partly, and in fact primarily, the writing of the memoir was an attempt by me to try and find her again through writing, because I'd always written, and writing seemed to me a way of ordering confusion and chaos and discovering stuff. So that's why I wrote it, was to try and find her, having lost her twice, essentially.
Thank you. Cathy, can I turn to you now? Could you tell us a little bit about Maddie?
Yes, it's so sad listening to Arifa and Gavanndra, and of course I've read both books, but also I just feel so sort of privileged to be here listening to you both, and with the audience as well, who have obviously all come for their own reasons. So it's kind of speaking to me really strongly of that sort of fellowship you can sometimes find, I think, in exploring things. So my brother Matty was 13 months younger than me and 9 inches taller than me. And he did have a sudden and shocking departure out of the quite nice life that we were leading in Yorkshire. He was knocked over by a car. What then didn't happen was he didn't die straight away. He was alive in a very brain damaged state, what's called a persistent vegetative state, which I still just gives me the shivers saying those words, for 8 years. And then at the end of 8 years, we went to the family court, my parents and I, to get permission to end his life. So I was 17 when he was knocked over and 24 or 5 when he died. I do remember thinking that I felt all my grieving had been done. at the point he died. I did seem to have been basically crying for 8 years, so I felt my grieving had been done. And then he died, and of course that turned out not to be true. Lots of drink, it's not a bad way to forget the old alcohol, but of course ultimately it doesn't do you any favors. Bit like Gavanndra, I feel my child was a catalyst in writing about it. I tried to write about it lots of times and failed. It was too hard, it was too difficult. I couldn't get anywhere. I couldn't see who would ever want to read it. It was too sad, it was too upsetting. If it's too upsetting for me to write, why will anyone else want to read it? And then I had, and I got used to when people ask that question, have you got any brothers and sisters, people would ask. And of course, the older you get, the less people ask it. But I got used to, I had a sort of a range of responses I'd used, which made me feel bad, because at one point I would say no, and then that would make me feel like I denied him in some sort of horrendous biblical way. But I got to the point where if somebody said, have you got any brothers and sisters? I would say, I had a brother, he died. I'd leave one pause, and then before they could step in it and think they had to say something, I'd say, it was a long time ago, which was my way of signaling to them, we don't need to discuss this anymore. I've told the truth, but it's over. And I knew what I was doing with that, and I had that as a strategy. And then I had my son, and he asked me once, I was in the supermarket, I had a little picture of me and Matty in my purse, and he leaned over. So he was, I don't know, 2, 3, sitting in the supermarket seat, and he poked at it and he said, who's that? And I thought, you know what, I'm not going to be able to say I had a brother, he died, it was a long time ago. That's not going to be enough for him. So what am I going to eventually say? And that kind of started me writing my book again, and I finished it. So when I finished The Last Act of Love, I was 42, so a long time after a lot of it had happened. And I do remain very kind of pleased and satisfied that I did manage to bring some order, I guess, to the chaos of those years and the chaos of my own emotions in those years. And what I really hope, actually, because of course I hope that if there's a me in a parallel universe who wrote the book but it didn't get published, because the book did get published and that changed my life. But I hope that if I'm in a parallel universe where it didn't get published, I just printed it out and put it on the shelf. Maybe I showed it to some people and they said they didn't want it. I hope that the person in that universe knows that the most important thing is that I wrote it for myself. And that's more important than anything else. I suspect she doesn't. She's probably feeling a bit upset that she didn't get it published. But I hope she does. I hope she knows that the most important thing is to write it. And these days, a lot of what I do is, I guess, encourage people to write a story primarily for themselves, really, because the more I'm writing my 6th book now, but the more I write, actually, the more convinced I am that the primary purpose of writing is as a tool for self-exploration and self-discovery before it's about sharing it with anyone else.
Yeah. I mean, picking up on that point, one thing I found, and I do want to talk about families because that's our sort of our theme for the weekend, but I was really struck that writing, we think about writing as therapeutic often, that it's good to get what you feel and think down. But Gavanndra, one thing that came through with you was that initially the writing was traumatic, that you had your coping strategy was about pushing things down, not looking at it, forgetting. So actually, when you return to writing, that's a very difficult experience because you're not being supported. And in fact, it seemed to trigger a similar kind of behavior of, I returned to the memories, but then I pushed them away. And it made me think about how it's not just writing in and of itself, but how you write, whether you're being supported, etc. And Cathy, with reading, because initially reading for you was a kind of escape. It was kind of, I don't have to think, I'll read until my head hits the pillow. and yet reading morphs for you from something that's simply escapist to a way of having a conversation with yourself, a form of thinking. So I think, writing is really important, but it's interesting that also sometimes you need support when you start writing, that it might not just be therapeutic, that it can be painful and in a way, I mean, does anyone want to pick up on that really? Gavanndra, what about you? Because it felt like that was the...
Yes, I mean, I think the point of, I think like all busy people, I was like, well, I haven't got time to go to see a therapist or do all this grief stuff that I'm meant to be doing. So I'm just going to sort it out myself. I'm going to write it down and that'll be absolutely fine. And I'm going to do it in the 2 hours before I have to go to work. And, you know, I'm just going to fit it all in and sort it out myself. And it was quite insane because I had so much unprocessed grief and trauma. And I had an incredibly chaotic, difficult childhood, and I hadn't really properly engaged with its impact on me at all. I had just kind of battled forward, almost like one of those, just like pushing forwards just to try and survive and get on with being alive, really. So to then and as you say, sort of pushed it all down and put these really horrible, terrifying, overwhelming memories away and not engaged with them, and then to suddenly think, I'm just going to open that box, look inside, rummage around, sort it out by myself, was sort of a bit mad. And it did definitely not feel safe for the first 6 months until I actually did start to go and seek professional help for what I was doing to help me put it in order. And I did a process called EMDR, which was super helpful because whenever I tried to think about my sister, all I could really think about was the moment that I had seen her die and watching her die. And EMDR is a sort of a way of dealing with PTSD so that you can sort of get beyond the body. I essentially felt like I was in my 14-year-old body once again, standing in the corner of a room in Tunisia watching that. And those processes just help turn a constantly relived trauma into memory. So that's essential. I kind of had to do that before I could then start to make it into words that made sense on a page.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Arifa, can I go to families now, and then maybe we can go back to kind of creativity and writing. I was really struck with your memoir, the way it really shows the way in grief we often have to go back over events, you know, bit by bit, rethink the death, rethink the relationship. And your father's relationship with your sister and his relationship with you was so different. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Oh, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Sorry, you hear
Okay.
me now? Yeah. And do say, there's somebody in the chat who said they couldn't hear me well, and I think I've got quite a soft voice, so I need to speak up. People should write if they still can't hear me. I think for me, in a way, grief brought on an audit of family and of relationships as a whole. Oh, great, it's better, says Pauline, thanks. It brought on a sort of audit of my life, where I am, who my sister was to me, where my sister and I were in the family, you know, in family positioning, and led us. We had a really intimate sisterly relationship. We shared a bedroom, we shared everything. Actually, she was my biggest friend as well as my sister. I looked up to her. She was 2 years older, but so much more worldly, better read. She's the one who introduced a lot of her too that I now have for art and for literature, books. She told me what to read, what to see. She dressed better than I did. You know, I really looked up to her as my, you know, bigger sister, much more sophisticated sister. And then there was a breaking away. I went to university and she just sunk into depression and serious eating disorder, sort of bulimia and anorexia, that really was to last throughout her life. I didn't say she died at the age of 4. In 2016, she was just 45 and I was 43. So unlike Gavanndra and Cathy, you know, we were both grown-ups when this happened. And unlike Gavanndra and Cathy, in terms of memory and when you write things down, I started writing about my sister actually in the year of the pandemic, very soon after she died. And I think that makes a difference. I still found weird things happening with memory, and it was raw, but I was addressing the grief. I was forced to address the grief by writing about it. But in terms of family dynamic, you know, and writing the story of a sibling's death, it was interesting because for a start, I'd had a really difficult early family life. My family had emigrated from Lahore in Pakistan to London. I was born in London, but 2 years earlier, my sister had been born in Lahore. My parents had had an arranged marriage. They both liked each other and wanted, they were introduced by families, but they were happy about this arranged marriage. My mother was only 26 or 27, but my father was a lot older, almost 40. And my mother didn't know it at the time, but my father had been deeply in love with a woman in London. He'd lived in London and married a woman in London, of German heritage. They'd had a marriage and a relationship for 7 years before he left her, divorced, came back to Pakistan, only because his family put pressure on him to do so. And I think he left, you know, in hindsight, and talking to my mother and talking to my uncles on my dad's side, I think he left sort of the love of his life, and he felt forced back into a life, far more traditional marriage and family life that he didn't want, actually. And it seems as if he'd gone down the wrong path. So when my mother became pregnant with my sister, he left for Pakistan. He left Pakistan for London, with the aim of having a home there, bringing, you know, his new wife and his unborn daughter to London. They were separated for a while, and for the first year of my sister's life, actually. And when my sister met my father for the first time, she was over a year old. It was at Heathrow Airport. My mother had come with great excitement for this new life with this daughter who was born without the father there. There was a sort of profound disconnect between them. And my sister cried, she was scared. Who is this strange man? My father seemed to respond to that. And in a way, even though it sounds ludicrous, that bad meeting at Heathrow Airport, my sister at the age of 13 months old, set a pattern of distrust and distance between them. When I came along 2 years later, I was the favorite. I was loved and adored very lavishly and openly. And there was a positioning that took place. In the family, I was the adored daughter. She wasn't. She was sort of cast out. And my brother came along afterwards, but it didn't knock me off the perch in a way. And that relationship, while my sister and I were incredibly close as teenagers, that her resentment and sadness and rage over that unfair positioning for no reason that she could control, being cast out by her father, that really got in the way of our sisterly relationship and our intimacy, actually. And she became jealous and resentful of me. And there was great moments of closeness where we spoke about this difficult childhood positioning, the fact that neither of us could have controlled it, and yet there were feelings that kind of festered and built up, and distrust built up between my sister and I, and you know, because of that positioning. So in my 20s and 30s, there were periods of closeness with her, and then periods of estrangement. And you know, when she died so suddenly, it was followed by regret, you know, because there had been that estrangement before she was taken to A&E when I ran, and, you know, made up, and we talked through things, and I saw the artwork that she'd been making, because she'd returned after a lifetime of depression to art school, and she showed me a bit of her art, and I discovered, you know, the person she'd become through her art after so long of a few years of not seeing her. And so when she died, there was enormous amounts of regret over that positioning, questions about why my father had done that. He has had dementia for the last 10 years. He couldn't answer those questions. They're locked away. And how do you make sense of that? How do you answer questions that can never be answered by certain people? When my sister wasn't around to help me answer some of the questions that remained around about her. My father couldn't help me. I couldn't access, you know, the past through him. So there were other ways I had to find to answer those questions or come to the terms with. There are certain questions that cannot be answered when somebody dies. They do leave these loose ends. You can't make sense of everything even through writing about it. You can come to peace with some of the unanswered questions. And the other thing about family and writing down, you know, grief, and the next step to publication is I think you have to consider not only the fact that you're writing about your grief, I was honouring my sister, actually. I felt she'd been silenced by so many systems. People with depression and difficult mental health difficulties and eating disorders are often misunderstood, mistrusted in the system, and silenced, I think, by the system, or treated like they're not to be trusted. Their testimony is not to be trusted. And I wanted partly this book to be about that, to give her a voice, strangely. But in doing that, I was exposing the family's sort of darkness and the contested realities, how I see my childhood and the positioning and all the things that my mother and father did may not be the way that she might have seen it, or the way that my brother sees it, or the way that my mother sees it. And also there's a case of my father who's still alive, who I'm writing about, but I haven't consulted because I can't. So there's the ethics around it as well. It's such a big thing, and I do think that grief brings on this audit about everything: who you are, who my sister was, who my father was, and my mother. What were they doing, raising us in a way that they obviously felt that was the only way they could. But I ended up questioning everything about everything, and then laying it on the page and laying it bare, and knowing that, fearing that it would upset my family more than the grief had upset them.
I think one thing you're very good at, Arifa, is actually preserving those different narratives all at the same time. So in the book, you're very good at saying, this is my memory, but is that the right memory? And actually,
Yes.
my mother has a different memory, and sort of holding your relationship with your father, as well as integrating the fact that he wasn't the loving, besotted person. And it does remind me a bit of Gavandra's book as well, because you had a very, close relationship with your father, and yet you're also rethinking him as an adult in terms of how he treated you, the fact that you were sort of surrounded by his drug dealing and taking care of everybody, and interested in your friends when you were a teenager. So there's a kind of you preserving that childhood loving relationship and really loving him, and I think that comes through, but also the adult you analyzing and feeling compassion eventually for your childhood self. I wonder if you want to pick up on that.
I mean, it's a complicated thing, because my father was a complicated man, and if you were to look at it dispassionately, you would say that he committed very many acts which could be considered abusive to, other young women who he was interested in. And I had a childhood surrounded by drugs, but I also had a childhood surrounded by love and fun. But I think what is interesting in terms of grief and memory and writing stuff down is that his descent into misbehavior was triggered by my sister's death, even though he had behaved, he'd been a drug addict, he'd got clean, but it was very much a trigger. So writing about him as an adult, I had to carry and hold lots of different emotions at the same time, an emotion, all the kind of the anger and confusion that I felt as a young woman about him and his behavior, and then also kind of anger with him about the way he treated my mother as well, who was sort of very kind of quite, is a much more kind of passive person than him, and was just dealing with grief in a very different way, but ultimately a much more kind of sensible and useful way than he was. But at the same time, people are flawed, and we can love flawed people, and I think I wanted to try and integrate that and not come down in a black or white sort of sense about my father. I wanted to kind of be straightforward about the nuance of who he was, that he was in some ways an awful man, but in some ways a wonderful man. I loved him dearly, and I was also furious with him. And as I've got older, the way I've thought about him I've had moments of being so angry with him, and the way I've, you know, even though he's also now dead, that doesn't mean that the way I feel about him is stuck at the moment he was when he died. You know, like I have my feelings for him change. I'm like, oh God, I'm really annoyed with you, or oh, actually the way you dealt with that was quite interesting, or you know, it's a constantly evolving thing. And then also it also is impacted by context as well, because I mean, there's no exonerating his behavior. You can't say it was the 70s or it was the 80s, it was fine. But we do think very differently and much more kind of with much more open eyes about old men and young girls and agency and what's correct and what's safe and what's not safe, you know. So
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
there's like the way that you personally engage with your parents, but then there's also how the conversation around you makes you rethink your past as well.
And I think both those perspectives are completely present in the book. I felt the love and, in a way, your generosity and your connection, but also your adult sense of what you'd experienced. Cathy, Maddie's accident completely upended your family, and you know, everything sort of turned on its head, and you had periods where you felt it should have been me who was in the accident. Can you talk a little bit about your family and the impact?
Yeah, so the way I tend to think about it was I felt we were balanced before. I feel, you know, it's years obviously since it happened, and you'd think, having talked about it as much as I do and all these books I write, but I can feel myself becoming sad. So I'm just, this is fine by me. I'd cry all the time, to be honest. If it were, I only put effort into not crying because, you know, society finds it weird, but I'm just sort of saying that to give myself a pause. So I felt that I came to see that it was we were sort of balanced when it was the four of us. And I did feel we were a bit like a car trundling along. And then when he was no longer there, it was more like we were, again, like a car with a missing wheel, and the tire had gone. So there's kind of like the metal was kind of like scraping along the road with all these sparks going everywhere, and the rest of us didn't know what to do. And I felt very much my parents very unusually, and of course it was a very lucky thing for me, extremely in love with each other, always have been, always will be. Was love at first sight when they were hardly more than children, and they're still very much in love with each other now. And of course that is brilliant. It's a wonderful way to grow up, but equally it meant that they remained a couple. They remained very much a pair, and I was the one that lost my other half, and I was the wheel on my own. And I still feel like that a bit, though I feel we've reformed ourselves more like, I think it was now as a bit like a Robin Reliant. So their wheels are there, but somehow I've managed to kind of, it functions, you know, the vehicle functions. I will never not be sad that my other wheel, my partner wheel, is not there. But we've learned to function as family, and I'd say a very good family. Again, if overbalanced, I know that I'm kind of, I don't think I ever sort of separated from them in the normal way that a teenager probably should do. But again, there's worse ways to be than a bit over close to your extremely nice parents. So I get that. And I think certainly for all of us, you know, like, I mean, I think it's safe to say my dad has just never got over it, but to all intents and purposes, he has got over it and has had a very fulfilling life. But equally, he's never got over it, and that it's present with him all the time. And he wouldn't, it's not necessarily how he would describe it, but I know it's very present from him. I think my mum in a way was more, my dad and I have this questionable ability. It's a very good skill, but also leads to problems, where we can completely put a brave face on it. So, you know, so on the day of my brother's funeral, we lived in this pub in Yorkshire. My dad and I were there sort of hosting the wake and what have you. And I remember my mum said, we came back from the church, she just said, I just have to go to bed. And she sort of slightly went to bed for a few days. But when she got up, she was okay. Whereas my dad and I were there putting the brave face on it, just sorting everything out, hosting the wake. And then, of course, at some point, the brave face doesn't work anymore. So there's been a bit more of that with us. But I think all families, I think sometimes it's a bit like a tree. You have different branches, and when one of those branches gets lopped off, it's like how you grow around that absence. And sometimes the absence can almost be as significant as the presence, I think. And
can I ask if you felt, because I felt this when my sister died, because she was so different to me, that I had to sort of absorb her personality and be both of us for my parents, if that makes sense. And I wondered if a similar thing happened to you, because I was the more bookish one and she was the more kind of fun outgoing one. So I thought, well, I've got to be her and me to keep my parents happy.
I think I've definitely thought, and arguably slightly do think, that I've got to provide them with what both offspring would have done. So I feel a bit over responsible. And then because I also feel damaged by what happened, I feel less capable of providing them.
Yeah, it's a terrible combination.
So, I've got this sort of like one measly child that I'm not that he's measly. I mean, you know, I kind of think if my brother's accident hadn't happened, maybe we'd have had Von Trapp families full of kids and we'd have been doing loads of stuff. Whereas as it was, I was like so screwed up that it took me till my mid-30s to think I could even manage to kind of like have one child, you know, so it's that sort of thing, which is probably not, it's not that necessarily is all true, but that's the sort of the trap, I think. It's the trap you can fall into. I mean, I would say I don't think my parents ever put this on me. I think I put all this responsibility in myself. And I want to quickly say, just in case we don't come back to it, I do think writing is an amazing tool for self-exploration, etc. But, you know, I've had lots of therapy. I'm not in any way saying that you should write about yourself instead of seeking therapeutic help for things. And I've had a lot of therapy, including EMDR, which I had after writing my book, which has been very helpful for me. And I think it's but as we're seeing here, I think whenever you share, when you share this stuff, it's almost the universality of it is where you do see it's not like the specific stories might be really individualized, but a lot of the experience you find common ground in.
Yeah, and Arifa, you also talk about the way your mum saw your sister in your face. So this clearly is something that seems to happen. And someone in the chat has said she felt the same way when her husband died, that she needed to be the mum and the dad. So you can see how losing, you know, a family member, it does create this interesting.
I think it creates a kind of pressure. I related to so much of what Cathy, and I feel so much for you, Cathy, that I'm just welling up, but we can't all start sobbing. But I do want to, but I'm not going to. But I think there is a pressure, and you know, Cathy, you're a lot younger, and so are you, Gavanndra, and there is, I think, immense pressure. Grief does that. It puts a lot of pressure on the family and on you, you know, and you feel isolated. I felt isolated like never before. I think I felt terribly, I really struggled with the fact that my older sister had died, and at 2 years along the line, I was older than my older sister. And where was she? Who was she to me? She would always remain my older sister. But in terms of sort of becoming her, I think we were in life, we were seen as opposites within the family configuration. We were very much seen as opposites, but actually we were very similar. And once she died, I began to see her in me. I began to see that I had, you know, issues around depression and eating disorders. And while she was alive, she was the one with that. And I'd sort of pressed down, I'd sort of kept mine very hidden, even from myself and certainly from the family. But once she'd gone, I sort of acknowledged that we were similar. We were sisters. There's something about, you know, siblings, and it might be the case with brothers as well, Cathy, but with sisters, because there's a sort of physical resemblance almost, you feel that you know, you can't always, there isn't a clear border of she is her and I am me. There's bits, there's quite an intermingling. There was for my sister and I, we had the same voice, we looked quite similar, and we liked the same things. And only in her death, I looked at her bookshelves. I remember going to her flat and we were clearing it out, which is really tragic. We had to clear it out very quickly. And everything, all the books in her, even though we'd been estranged for years, all the books that she'd been reading and that she had on her shelf were my books. It was so uncanny. And so there was this slight blurring of, you know, I kind of felt that I could allow to see certain things about her that I'd been too scared to see in me, and I could finally say to myself, yes, I was a lot like her. I did suffer from the same things as her. We did share a lot in common, and find her in myself. And also other people started finding her in me. My mum started seeing that I looked more like her the older I was getting.
There's this, I'm going to admit something really, really dreadful now, but I have lots of friends who have sisters, and I get very jealous of them when they look similar. You know, sorry. No, I'm going to cry. But anyway, yeah.
I'm jealous of people with brothers. And again, I'll confess this to all of us. I kind of I'm writing a novel at the moment, and I almost didn't realize, my editor read an early draft and she said it's really moving that you're writing about grown-up siblings, that you're writing about these really close siblings. And I genuinely hadn't realized until that moment that really is what that novel is about. It's just my wish fulfillment to have a lovely brother. And they're exactly the same. It's the same age gap. It's this, you know, but I kind of almost hadn't realized I was doing it, which again is peculiar and slightly torturing to do, except now I've lent into it. I realized it's kind of...
I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but before I do, I just want to, before I go there, just have a final thought about the creativity in the writing, which we've kind of circled around. And I guess, and I was really struck by Gavanndra, like the moment when your acupuncturist thinks she sees someone in the room and there's a child in the room, and you finally kind of imaginatively comfort your sister and tell her how she died. I was so moved by that. And it was almost as if that compassion you showed to Candy allowed you to feel compassion to yourself.
I think it allowed me to access emotions that I had shut off in myself. So compassion to myself, compassion to my sister. Like I just hadn't had the kind of bandwidth to feel those emotions, because it had all been, you know, I kind of felt like if I started feeling those things, I would just like melt in a pile in the corner. So I just I couldn't do it. But it was, I mean, it was completely mad, that moment. So I went to see an acupuncturist, and she's also like a Reiki healer and a bit woo-woo. And I'd never written about my sister. I barely spoke about her. And she was in the middle of doing the acupuncture. She's like, right, there's someone else here with us. She smells very strongly of sweets. Do you know anyone who really likes sweets? And I was like, she's very impatient. She's a young girl. She's very impatient. And then I sort of thought, well, my sister died super suddenly and she didn't know how she died. And we all just pretended that she hadn't died. So maybe, you know, so I just thought, okay, this is insane, but I'm just going to go with it. I was like, well, maybe it's Candy. And the lady was like, yes, she's here. And you need to tell her why she died and what happened to her, because she doesn't know. So I kind of went through that process of talking to her in a way that I had never done. And I kind of allowed her, as you say, sort of imaginatively into my brain and into my heart. And perhaps that was sort of the beginning of a softening and allowing myself, because it's about kind of, if you refuse to feel grief, then you can't feel love as well. So your emotional bandwidth becomes so sort of constrained. And I think that's what I'd done to myself. And I could feel it in my family. And that was another of the reasons why I wanted to write, because I was like, I feel like sometimes I'm standing behind a pane of glass with all these lovely people and these lovely children and husband, you know, I'm not emotionally kind of tuning in, because I've constrained my emotional responses to such a small kind of space.
Well, it's the things that had helped you survive then became disabling in terms of you loving and living your life and feeling connected. And I was really struck, Arifa, with one of the things I loved about your book is the way that the theatre and films all become a way for you to think through and feel emotions, and also to connect and almost converse with your sister. The bit I found incredibly powerful was when you go and see that version of Antigone. And, you know, initially you're thinking about, I'm a terrible sister, I didn't do self-sacrifice, you know, but then suddenly there's the moment where, you know,
the sister says,
you know, I'm going to say I did it. And she says, you know, I want you to live. And these words,
it was an incredibly powerful way to see, to channel my grief, but slightly safer, you know, because grief, I think for me was really explosive. I felt real jealousy towards other people, having their siblings and having happiness. Actually, that sounds really mean, but and I felt real rage towards the world, real anger towards everybody, and just angry at the world that this had happened to me. And it was quite explosive. And I remember going for therapy, and she was saying, you know, this, you could put it in a box and open it up gently, and you know, that's how explosive it felt, that it could only be brought up in little bits. And in a way, I turned to art, you know, like films and books, because that's what I do. And that's what my sister and I love doing, talking about books and films and what they meant to, seeing the world through them. But suddenly there were these really difficult emotions around sisters. You know, I felt guilt that I hadn't helped her enough through her depression, and all of the rest, that I'd gone off and lived my successful, happy life and she'd left her, and so many other complicated feelings that maybe it was too much to face just head on. So I watched things like Antigone, and you know, when you're going through a very powerful experience like grief, suddenly the world, you see it with grief goggles. Suddenly you see everything differently. And I began to see books differently. I began to see films. I began to see and hear her, or hear grief, or hear what life's about. You know, all the questions that I was wrestling with, I saw, you know, with the moment in Antigone when the two sisters, you know, one sacrifices herself. And when I'd seen Antigone millions of times. I'm a theatre critic, but it was just after her death when I heard the sister who dies say to the living sister, I don't want you sacrificing yourself. I want you to go and live. And it clicked, it dramatically shifted my understanding of my sister, that she would never have wanted me to be depressed with her and do nothing with my life. She wanted me to do things with my life. She was, you know, there are ways now I see her saying it that I didn't hear and see then. And, you know, even Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which is a Betty Davis film about two rivalrous sisters, I saw that and I felt deeply sad for the rivalry that had been caused by a father in that film. And in a way, the rivalry between my sister and I, the difficult fact, had been based on that father relationship. So it became a way, in a way, I couldn't help it. The whole world, you know, becomes about your grief, I think, when it's so overwhelming. And that's the way, it was a creative way to channel it. And also the layers of memory, because at first grief seems like it's just black. And then you realize if you peel away, there are other colors and shades and other memories, actually. And like, the more I wrote, the more I remembered, and the more surprised I was about certain memories that I thought, how could I have forgotten? I've got a good memory. How could I have forgotten this?
No, amazing. All right, I'm going to have a look at the questions. Cathy, as I do that, what would be your, we've had a few people say they're inspired by what you've said in terms of starting to write. Do you have some advice for people who are thinking of doing this? And I will look at some questions.
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing I would say is just kind of like have a go and start writing it down. I think it's really helpful to just write it down for yourself. So there's a quote I really like, was Nora Ephron, which is that be the heroine of your life and not the victim. And I think one of the things that writing for yourself offers you is that it just does offer you that opportunity, that, you know, that this is the way I see it, this is the way I think about it. I'd start just with that and just write down, again, don't worry about it being beautiful sentences. Don't start off thinking that you're going to create art or create something that's shareable with other people. Just start writing it down, note forms even, because sometimes sentences can feel a bit much. And people ask me, actually, I'll say this one, because often people ask me now, because obviously I wasn't writing when it happened and I wrote about it much later. But what I do now, if something bad happens, which it has, is I do manage to take myself to the page and just make some kind of record about it, really perfunctory, not with the idea that I will share it with everyone or anyone ever, just note form. But I really like the fact, and it makes me feel better and we've all had these moments, I think, in the past few years, when the shit has really hit the fan in some sort of a way, that I have managed before going to sleep to get through the day and get to the page and just actually put down in my diary, often just some facts about what happened. And I would really recommend that, again, with not worrying about it being good writing and not worrying about it sharing it with anyone. at the beginning. So as I said, a tool for self-exploration, a tool for
Yeah.
self-discovery. And I think
that's really important. There's so many places I could go, like Gavanndra burning up her writing, but I feel like I have to ask a question. So this first question is from Louise. Can I ask how today's guests dealt with their parents' grief and what they needed from them that they did or didn't get? My eldest son died 2.5 years ago. My younger son was 11 at the time. I'm so conscious of the fact that he is dealing with his own grief, but also navigating life with broken parents. So what advice would you give?
I mean, it's just really hard, isn't it? And I just feel for you. And of course, I was once a bereaved sister thinking about my parents. And these days, I'm the mother of a 13-year-old boy. So that gives me, I think, a different perspective often. Often when people talk to me about my book that's about the death of my brother, I now feel I almost respond as the mother that I have become. So I think that, I just really want to send a message of love to you. I think being aware of the traps is quite useful. You know, you're here, you're aware of the potential pitfall that the surviving sibling thinks they have to be everything. And I think if you're aware of that, then you can kind of almost like think that probably won't happen because you're aware of that, if that makes sense.
I would also think just giving the child opportunities to talk about their sibling in a way that isn't a super serious conversation, you know, but like having that sibling be part of the family, part of discussions, if possible, in a way that isn't heavy, but, oh, let's make, you know, spaghetti bolognese tonight. That was April's favorite food, you know, kind of,
Candy, because I found it really hard to talk about candy with my daughters. I know it's not quite the same situation, but I sort of didn't know how to tell them that they had I had a little sister who died when she was 9. Suddenly that felt so terrifying to kind of burden them with. So eventually what we did is I told them about Candy, and I said Candy really loved cake and she really loved pink and she was quite crazy. So what we did is for her birthday, we made a crazy pink cake. And I said to the girls, you can run around Sainsbury's, you can literally pick up every single sweet there is, and we will make the silliest cake that's ever been made for Candy. And then we do that every year. So now in their head, they do not associate their aunt with a little girl who dies in a hotel room age 9. They associate her with an insane, massive pink cake. So I guess if you can talk about a child and integrate a child into your conversations, but do it in a way that is full of their life rather than full of their death.
And I think that's great. I would just add that I think children are really sensitive towards adults and will censor themselves if they feel they're going to upset an adult. I have 2 nieces. The 2 nieces would never talk about my sister to me, so I thought they were really upset and, you know, they didn't want to talk about her. But actually they were constantly talking about my late sister to their mother. And it turned out that they didn't want to hurt me by bringing it up. They thought it would upset me and make me cry because they've seen me cry at her grave. And it was only once I'd given them permission of bringing her up myself in a sort of, oh, she loved art, this is what she did, in quite a casual way, a bit like your cake, you know, kind of joyful. But they don't stop talking about her. And one of them will say, I barely remember her, what was she like? And she's able to just be honest. And the other quick thing is that I have a dear friend who has had 2 daughters and one died shockingly and suddenly. And the sister, the daughter that's alive, has had difficulties around, you know, always being positive about her sister. And that sounds like it's hard because as a mother, you're grieving the fact that you've lost